scientists identified, and then move beyond that toward ways to fix it. And I've written a book, which is what this is going to be about today. And of course, in 15 minutes, I'll only give you a very, very brief outline of some of the issues. And the issues that are in the book are basically coming up every day now. The title, Science as a Contact Sport, inside the Palisade Air's Climate, I contrived because in a way it's my autobiographical experience in the last 39 years, beginning back in 1970 as a graduate student, calculating out climate change and thinking that the dust and smoke, which are aerosols, which cool the planet, by the way, from human activities, were probably even more important than the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide. So we were concerned about that in those days, but we had very little data. And in the next 2 years, we visited with many colleagues, got the data, found out that the aerosols were only spread over about a quarter of the world, and therefore we had to reduce the cooling part by a factor of 4, which we did, of course. And there was more than one greenhouse gas, not just CO2, but many. So it became clear to me and most of my colleagues by the mid-1970s that warming was much more likely than cooling from human activities. Not, this is, of course, superimposed on the natural background variability that's always there. So it's now called AGW, or anthropogenic global warming. And I traced the history of that and how 35 years ago, when I and other colleagues testified to the U.S. Congress, the members of Parliament in many countries, met with ministers, even did a presidential briefing with the Nixon administration. So there's absolutely no one who can say that we didn't know back then. However, what we knew was largely based on theory. We knew that you can't trap a few watts of energy per square meter and have no effect, but how much that was going to warm up relative to the natural background variability was still largely theory. And what's happened in the last 35 years, and why there's such a gathering here and so much momentum now toward international action, is because in the last 35 years, nature has been cooperating with theory, and a lot of those things that were projected as possible, like a tremendous increase in heat waves, decrease in cool waves, melting of ice, increase in fires in intermittent climates, and so forth, have been observed, and in some cases even more strongly than we thought then. So this is the history of who tried to push the problem forward, who tried to block it, how the scientific community interacts in the public world where they have very little experience often and considerable disdain, and the nature of the communication of this problem through the media. So I'll give you a very, very fast overview, and then we'll have in the remaining 10 minutes or so time for question and answers, and anybody with a media badge is welcome to a book. Oh, there it is. It's Science and Contact Sport. It's published by the National Geographic Society Press. Well, I said it tends to be contentious. This is a cartoon from the New Yorker from probably 35 years ago, and it shows a couple of old stodgy, I guess, chemists looking at this. One thing I'll say for us, Meyer, we never stooped to popularizing science. And in fact, there's a wide belief among many scientists that the trouble with popularizing is you have to simplify to meet the soundbite prerequisites that often happens out there in the world, and that therefore you can't do what good scientists should, which is to give all the ifs and buts and caveats. Of course you can, you just can't do them in the soundbite. So I'll tell you in a minute what I argued, how you do that, how I try to do it, and how I explain it in a long chapter in the book. And it's the topic that I come up amusingly called meteorology, which is how do you interact out there in the real world where you do not have the luxury of the time to explain all things, and try to at the same time convey both urgency and uncertainty. And because if you don't convey uncertainty, you're not telling the whole story. If you don't convey urgency, you're not telling the whole story. So ways to do that, and my answer, of course, is to use metaphors like loading dice and insurance and other things. But we try to do it, that way. The second way that I've always advocated is, even though you cannot in a soundbite or in an op-ed give full disclosure on a range of problems, what you can do is have a hierarchy of backup projects. You can write Scientific American length articles or put them in the Atlantic Monthly or some other such magazine. You can have large websites, as I do, with almost all full disclosure, all the details. And you also can write full-length books. And when you do, I hope that you will explain what you did wrong, as I do in the first chapter about why I was wrong about cooling. In fact, it's one of the things I'm most proud of. Because if you make a mistake in science because the evidence is insufficient or your logic is wrong, and then you interact with your colleagues, you get new data, and you don't revise, we view you as dishonest. So when I hear some pundits sitting there and saying, oh, well, you're a professor flip-flop, you went from cooling to warming, and I'll say, yes, I'm very proud of it, because I was the first guy who published what was wrong with my own stuff. That's what we do in science. We're driven by evidence, not by ideology. And in fact, unfortunately, this problem has been hijacked by ideologues who then exploit the media doctrine of balance, which we'll talk about in a minute. So here was a George Will, conservative columnist, cartoon back in Kyoto, objecting to the fact that that only the developed world was supposed to take targets and it wasn't a level playing field. Well, that famous paper publishing journalist, Professor Will, forgot to tell you that the playing field hasn't been level for a century because the per capita emissions of the majority of the world, the average of the world is 4 tons per capita. In the United States it's 20. In Texas it's 33, and in California it's 10, because we have rules for performance standards, but that's another story. So the point is, the context is, how could you have a level playing field snapped on when it hasn't been for a long time? And this has been well recognized in the human system as common differentiated responsibilities. Basically, everybody has to play, or you can't solve the problem with commons, but not necessarily everybody has to pay. Therefore, it's a large trade negotiation, and that explains, as I try to explain to my students and scientific colleagues, why the majority of delegates here are not scientists, but in fact are lawyers, negotiators, economists, and trade people, because in the end, the policy issue is as much or more about equity than it is about science or economics. It's a mixture of both, and we have to recognize that. All of that is in the book, and I do it in detail. Well, the cartoons from the right, there are cartoons from the left, Bush's science and so forth. And this is sort of the classical media balance, right? In political reporting, it is absolutely fair and balanced. Get the Democrat, get the Republican, completely appropriate doctrine in two-party politics. However, when you're covering science, you don't get a deep ecology group who cites only the worst cases and the end of the world, and then you get somebody from the Enterprise Institute who tells you carbon dioxide is plant food, it's good for you, forgets to tell you it fertilizes weeds and acidifies the oceans. So you get a parade in the popular media, end of the world, and good for you, the two lowest probability outcomes. This problem is a bell curve, and all honest scientists tell you that. But I'm constantly asked this question, is the science settled? And I love doing polls with my audiences on it. So here, how many of you think the science of the anthropogenic global warming is not very detailed, but largely understood? And a good fraction. How many think it's not? How many think it's a stupid question? Right. Why? Because complex system science, and I say this in every book and everything, it has basically 3 components. This is what's from, in fact, the guidance paper in the IPCC, Chris Field knows as well. Well-established, there are well-established components, and they are not refuted by what is speculative. The speculative does not trump the well-established. Every detail does not have to be known in any system science before you can identify a preponderance. And what else? Then we have problems where we work very hard and we got it down from a complete uncertainty to a few competing explanations, like what are the tipping points for the Greenland ice sheet? There are competing explanations about that, and then there are speculative. And unfortunately, out there in the media debate, where all sides seem to get equal credibility without a quality weight, what ends up happening is that you get equal time on the end of the world and there are few extremes. The public is understandably confused, and it's hard for that strange creature, the honest politician, not always an oxymoron, to be able to operate when the public censoring them because they don't understand the problem because they've been confused by a false balance. And I keep arguing what we need is perspective, not balance. Report all positions, but report their relative credibility. Most of what the scientific community does through the IPCC and others is to come out with the many possible outcomes and winnow out from that the relative likelihood of these and list the ranges and the likelihoods. The likelihoods are more important than anything else. Almost all decisions in business, in health, and in security are made on the basis of multiple possible outcomes where the likelihoods need to be addressed. And that's how I always frame the problem. Well, what's well established? Global warming is unequivocal. That's from the IPCC. That's a very strong word for physicists and chemists in the working group 1, and that's because it's based on an overwhelming preponderance of evidence. There it is. That's what it looks like. Now, this has been challenged. In fact, I was testifying in Congress about a year and a half ago, and one of the congressmen, I guess Congressman Rohrabacher, said, hasn't that global warming, hasn't that greenhouse gases been increasing in the last 10 years? Yes, sir. Has it been warming? No, it's been flat. Therefore, I falsified global warming. And I said, no, you haven't. And, but it should have warmed. And I said, no, that's not how it works. Because climatologists define climate as 30-year averages. Because if I had what statisticians call cherry-picked, he went to the warmest year, 98, and then extrapolated out. If I had cherry-picked the same way he did, from 92 to 98, we were going to hell in a handbasket. That's all noise superimposed on a rising trend, well known, well understood by scientists, and that's why they made the statement. And even if you want to argue that the last 10 years haven't moved up very much, been relatively flat, they've also been the warmest decade over the last 1,000 years based upon the bulk of the analyses. Now, let me talk briefly in the last few minutes about the hockey stick. So there's the hockey stick. This is from an IPCC figure that had it. So here's the handle, and there's the blade. This up there is thermometer measurements. That's the unequivocal part. And the handle is a reconstruction from true rings and from coral reefs and from many, many proxies. These proxies are not temperature. There's multiple ways to combine them, and there's no right way. So the first people who did it, Mann, Bradley, and Hughes, they used the hockey stick, which was completely different than what existed before, which was largely ship captains' logs in the North Atlantic that Hubert Lamb, a climate historian, had beautifully put together, but it did not have hemispheric coverage and it wasn't calibrated. So you have a period in here where you have the actual temperature measurements and you've got the thickness of tree rings, so you calibrate. That allows you a more quantitative backward extrapolation. But there's multiple ways to calibrate. There's no right answer. So, the hockey stick debate in AGW, anthropogenic global warming. Well, there are people who have said now, because of hacked emails, which imply that these leaders were unsure and that they didn't know quite what to do about various details and how are they going to treat it, and they used a very, very standard word that's jargon in science and mathematics, but has a different meaning in the public, a trick. Well, a trick is not, as we know in Halloween, right, trick or treat, right? A trick is somewhere where you're fooling the public. Well, it's been framed by this group, and I would call them the deniers. And I distinguish between a skeptic and a denier. All good scientists are skeptics. We're skeptics by definition. I was skeptical of my own cooling theory and took it to warming when the evidence changed. I did the same thing with nuclear winter in the 80s when I took it from nuclear winter to nuclear fall, getting hate mail from the peace movement. That's the way the evidence laid out. That's how we did it. A skeptic is a person who looks at. A denier is someone who does not agree that there's a preponderance of evidence when the overwhelming literature shows there is. So I distinguish between the two. And if people tell me denier is a pejorative word, it's because I intend to be pejorative, because if somebody can look at all those papers on all that data and conclude there's no preponderance, I believe they have either not looked at it correctly or they're ideological stairs. And that's my view and how I explain it. That's what actually the hockey stick looks like. It's got a very weighty handle. There are some dozen studies now, and the fact that one study may or may not be flawed in terms of its assumptions and the behavior of its authors, it does not in the slightest overrule the vast number of other studies that made different assumptions. Science is based upon multiple replications by multiple groups, and when you have large numbers of them and they converge, then the confidence you express goes up. That's how IPCC works. And, as I heard from the Saudi delegate, I understand, had said that in the G77 caucus, that I'd like to get confirmed that this is true, but it was reported, several people told me, he said, because of the hockey sticks uncertainty, therefore anthropogenic global warming is disproved and Copenhagen should be canceled. Well, is anthropogenic warming disproved by this? Absolutely not. The IPCC never used the hockey stick in order to make any confident statements about anthropogenic warming. It used, I haven't got time to explain this, it used fingerprints. Is the stratosphere warming or cooling? The answer is it's cooling, the troposphere is warming. That's a fingerprint of human activities. Middle of continents warming up toward the middle ocean. Fingerprint of human activities. There are about 5 of these fingerprints now. There was only one in 95 when they said it was discernible. So the number of bits of evidence has increased, and that's precisely how it's done, and why IPCC has no reason to revise its probabilities, and regardless of how this debate turns out. So, what's it been called? ClimateGate. Very weird. Who framed that? The deniers. This is the same thing as if the Watergate, remember Gate came from Watergate. It was a break-in ordered by Nixon, and it was Republican Republicans. They're breaking into the Democratic headquarters, and it's as if had they gotten the document that had said something questionable, that therefore they would be the heroes of investigative journalism, and the Democrats would be the goat. We've got it exactly backwards. That's what it is. It's climate denier gate, because the ones who have broken the law and then redacted using out-of-context quotes and emails, they're the ones who should receive the enmity of the public. And indeed, regardless of whether these emails are true or not true, out of context or not, it's a tiny fraction. And the final thing I'll end with is the papers that a number of those emails say people did not want to get in the process because they were so bad. I agree. They were very flawed, and there was a breakdown in the journal that published them, and the editor was fired by the board for accepting papers that did not do well in peer review. However, they still were in the IPCC. So therefore, almost all those allegations are false. They're driven by ideologues and special interests. The ideologues who do not want to have interference with entrepreneurial rights and special interests that want to maintain the status quo. The whole thing is discussed in great detail in Sciences Context Forum, and thanks for listening.